Hello everyone, and welcome to your 53rd Cocoa programming tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how we can work with groups in view-based NSTableView. Now this is a continuation of lesson 51 and 52, where we were talking about view-based NSTableViews. And if you don't have the code from lesson 52 lying around, either go through those tutorials again, create it yourself, or you can download it from the GitHub page where I have all the code available online there. So for any tutorial that I have, it's all there. Alright, with that out of the way, let's talk about groups, because this is going to be a very long tutorial. So with this, we can see that this is essentially what we'll have as a completed application when we're done. So in the previous tutorial, we just had the flags. That's what we were displaying before. We were just displaying the stuff that was in the flags folder. In this tutorial, we're going to branch it out and show everything that's in the what am I looking for? Everything that's in the iChat icons folder. That's what I'm trying to say. So as you can see, the groups or the group rows that we have here are represented just by the names of the folders. So a good way to use a group. So what do you get if you're a group row? Well, there's nothing really special about the row in particular. You just tell the table view, hey, make this row a group row, and it will. So what that means is that we can see here that the background sort of becomes grayish. It's sort of sort of semi-transparent, and it hovers over the content that it groups. If we kept scrolling up on this, eventually the flags group would push this group out of the way, and then it would start hovering over the flags as we kept scrolling through the flags. That's a group, and if you need a practical example, you can look on your iOS device, and I'm pretty sure the music app does the same thing. So similar stuff. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin. Like I said, it's going to be a long tutorial, so let's not waste time. We want to first, in Interface Builder, change the identifier that's on our main cell here, which is this one here. We want to just change this to be image cell. I think it's just more appropriate for this tutorial since it's not the only cell. We're also going to set this NSText field to be the group cell, and that's just because it's going to be a group, or what the groups look like. Alright, then we want to center this text. We want to make it a little bit larger, so I'll set it to 18, and then we can resize this, and you'll notice when we do that the height of this label is going to be 22 pixels high. And in case you couldn't see that when you were doing it, you can go over to the inspector over here and see that the height of your label is 22 pixels, or points high. That's important. We'll use that later. Alright, let's hop over to code now that we're done in Interface Builder. So this is where the majority of this tutorial is going to go into, is kind of restructuring this application. Unfortunately, it doesn't really have to do a lot with groups. The groups is going to come at the very end, but we're restructuring this application to work on a more complex table view basis. So the previous two tutorials, we were working with a fairly simple example, right? Just listing a bunch of images in a folder. Nothing overly spectacular. So if you're creating a more complex user interface, though, with multiple groups or multiple, separate types of things, you really do want to create objects for these, and not only for because we have a group and an image cell in this example, but for other reasons as well. Readability. It's a lot easier to look at code and say, hey, this is an image thing versus and a folder, right? Versus this is a dictionary object and has a bunch of keys, right? I have no idea what this thing really does. It's a dictionary. So it helps for code readability when you come back to look at this project later. It also helps from the standpoint of but drag and drop. I don't even know if it's possible to use NS Dictionary with drag and drop. Maybe it is, but I'd have to look at that. But nonetheless, to actually use drag and drop, we can embed that into the model objects themselves, and they can figure out the pasteboard stuff in there. So creating separate objects to represent your images and folders is a very good idea, and that's what we're going to be doing in this tutorial to replace the NS Dictionary. Alright, let's go ahead and hit Command N here to create a new Objective-C class. We're going to be calling these desktop entity, like so, and we'll save it to our lesson 53 here. Alright, so here we go. And what is this desktop entity? Well, a desktop entity is just something that is represented on the file system. And if you've seen this similar thing, you've probably looked at Apple's source code on TableView Playground. That's really where I'm taking this from, so I'll give Apple credit for that. But basically, we're dumbing down that example for just to represent groups. So a desktop entity just represents something that's on your file system. So a folder or an image, something that you can hit on your file system. To represent this, we're going to be using an NSURL. Now, I haven't really used URLs in the past, although I should have in many places. And the previous section here, where we were dealing with just this path, there's sort of two ways that you can work with objects in your file system, right? You can use an NSString to represent it as a path, or you can use an NSURL. NSURL is a dedicated class, though, to handling different it can really inspect the URL that it has. So versus an NSString, which is just a bunch of characters, NSURL kind of understands the file system, and there's a bunch of methods you can use to actually extract information about what the type is. So it's much more powerful than just using NSString, and we'll see that as we go through. Another property, or we could make this a method, but we'll make it a property. Strong read only. We're going to make an NSString for the name. So we're just going to get the name back of the file that we're being represented as, and that can easily be done. The next thing is to get an initializer here. So init with file URL will be the dedicated initializer we'll use, and we want file URL as the name. Another method we're going to make is a class method, which means you don't use an instance, you just use the class name. So I'd say desktop entity and then this method. This method is going to give us back a specific desktop entity object depending on the URL. So this is actually pretty cool. So you can say entity for URL, pass in some kind of NSURL, and what this method's going to do is determine, based on the URL, what type of thing we're dealing with. So it'll either return back an image entity or a folder entity depending on what the URL is. So we'll see how that works in just a bit. We're also going to add other classes to this file. Now I know I've never actually done this in my other tutorials, but it's actually quite common throughout Apple stuff, and you might have seen it if you watched my core animation tutorials. We were searching through some Apple stuff, and in one of the core animation header files, you can see that they're putting multiple classes in the same header file, and they do this quite often actually. So instead of making a separate Objective-C file, we're just going to embed a bunch of classes in this same header file. This is useful because then you can just import one header file and then you have everything. So anyway, desktop entity, we want to use desktop image entity. So this is going to be a subclass of the desktop entity. And we're also going to make another class, and we're going to call it desktop folder entity, and it will be a subclass of desktop entity as well. Now, why are we making these subclasses of desktop entity? Well, because both images and folders have URLs to them, right? They both have names, and they both can be initialized with the file URL. So they're perfect candidates to be subclassed. And if they're used, then this method will be called as well. So they're exactly what you would want to subclass desktop entity, because they are a desktop entity. They're just a subclass thereof. They're a specific type. The other thing that we want to add here is a property to add a image. So NSImage image, and that belongs to the image entity. The folder entity really doesn't have anything too particular to it, so we're just going to leave it for now. Flip over to the source side of our implementation section here. Again, this is just in desktop entity.m, so in case you didn't know what I was doing there. Let's implement some methods. So we want to implement init with file URL. This is fairly self-explanatory. It's the standard stuff you always see. So super init if self file URL gets file URL, return self. Nothing special that you haven't seen already. The next part is, I guess, special because you probably haven't seen this, which is where we're going to return a specific subclass of our desktop entity. So we want to have, depending on the URL, like I was saying, either return an image or a folder entity, and we can do this by inspecting the URL. So go ahead and create an NS string, and you can just call it type identifier. And what this type identifier is going to do is essentially ask the URL, or we're going to set it, depending on what the URL's type is. So every URL can figure out what type it is, whether it's an image type, a folder type, a bundle type. There's a million types out there, but there's one easy method that you can use on NSURL to figure out what type it is. So this is URL, and the method we want is get resource value for key error. So get resource value, you simply pass in a pointer to an object. So this object is going to be an NS string in our case, and we want to pass the reference of the NS string so that when it wants to actually set the value that the NS string points to, then it can change what the this type identifier is actually pointing to, and we get back that NS string object by reference. Alright, so we want to pass in the address, type identifier, and then we want to use the key NSURL localized name key. Or no, sorry, I do not want to do that. I want to use NSURL type identifier key, and this will get us the type identifier for the URL. So here's the URL, right? And we're asking for specific type identifier, and then it will set that type identifier to whatever the string is that we pass in, and then we get back that string, right? Because we passed it in. Alright, so now that we have that, we just have to figure out what the type is. So we could have an image type, we could have a folder type, right? We have to figure out what the type identifier was set to. So to figure out what the image types are, we have to create an array of all the possible image types, because there's a lot of possible image types you can have. So to get all the image types, you can ask the NSImage class using the class method image types, and that will return for you an array of all the possible image types NSImage accepts. With that, we can now start testing to see if our type identifier is part of that array. And I'm going to label this image types. Alright, so if the image types contains the object type identifier, right? So if basically the type identifier is part of the image types, if it is an image type, then it will excuse me, it will then just what am I trying to say? If it's part of the image types, then it will simply we want to be an image type. So to become an image type, we can return a desktop image entity, and alloc init that with the file URL. Okay, so now that we have that, we can also check to see if it's a folder, right? If the type identifier is equal to the string, and there's a bunch of strings listed for different types. Now, this is kind of a hidden thing, and you kind of have to search for them, but the constants basically that we have for different types in the file system start with k, ut, and then type. So k, ut, type, and then folder is the one I want. So these are all CF string refs, and that just means that they're core foundation objects, but they can be typecasted to be Objective-C objects, which we want to do there. Okay, now that we are checking that, we're seeing if the type identifier is a type folder. So if it's a folder type, if it is, then we want to get back a desktop folder entity, and we'll alloc init that with the file URL. Awesome. All right. Now if all that fails, we'll return nil, and our method is good. All right, what else can we implement? Well, we have to implement that name. So to figure out the name, we can use the URL that's set on the object. So that's using the file URL property. So we do the same sort of inspection that we did in the previous method with the get resource value one. We just say NSString name, and if the URL get resource, And what am I doing wrong here? Get resource. Oh, right, I have no parameter. You say self.fileURL, get resource, and we want to pass in the name, so we use ampersand name. For key, NSURL, type, no, I keep switching these. I want to say NSURL localize name key, and that simply gets the name of the file. So whatever the URL points to, then it will give us back the name of the file. So basically the last little bit of the name, right? Wherever the file is located. All right, with that, we can return the name, and else we can not return the name because it didn't work for some reason. All right, that's that. So there we go. We're perfect and ready for our desktop entity. Now we have to implement the other few methods here. So go ahead and implementation desktop image entity. This one we want to return the image. So we'll do this lazily. So we'll say if there's no image, then we'll make an image, and we'll say NSImage alloc init by referencing file, and the file is, or no, I don't want to do referencing file, I want to do referencing URL, and the URL will be self.fileURL, like so. And then when we're all said and done, we can return the image like that. Awesome. Last little bit is to implement the other class, which is the desktop folder entity, and there's nothing there, so we really don't have to do anything. All right, we're good to go. So that's everything that we should have to do for the desktop entity classes. And now we have dedicated objects that represent both images and URLs in the file system. All right, now the fun begins, where we have to break apart a bunch of stuff that we started here. So let's start at the top. We got our path, and we want our path though to go to the iChat icons, right? So we'll just leave it as that, and we'll get rid of that flags part. Then we'll create an NSURL out of that. So we can say URL, and we want to init file URL with path, and we just pass in the path. All right, the other part we're going to want to change is to use the enumerator at URL. So this method takes in, obviously, a URL. It asks for these property keys, and that doesn't matter. We don't need it, so we're just going to pass in nil, and I don't even remember what it represents, so don't ask me. And then options, the options parameter is simply for if you're enumerating through things, you can skip over different subdirectories if you don't want them, but we just want to go through everything, so we're going to leave that as 0. The error handler is whether to stop if you hit an error. So if you have an error occur as you're enumerating through this and you return no, then you will stop enumerating through it. But we don't want that to happen, so we'll just say return yes. All right, let's scrap all this code too, and we're going to make a for in. The for in will take an NSURL, call it file URL, in collection directory enumerator. So that'll go through the directory enumerator and fetch all the objects that are in there. All right, now we just create different entities depending on the file URL. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to use the entity for URL class method that we made before. So we have to import, of course, our desktop entity.h. And once we've done that, we can start creating some objects. So we'll make a desktop entity, call it entity, and we want the desktop entity to give us back an entity for the specific URL. So to figure that out, we just pass it in the file URL. Okay, and then the next part is to simply add these to the table view or the table contents. So add object entity. There we go. All right, so that's said and done. It'll look at the file URL, figure out if it's an image or a folder, and then we add that to the table contents. Number of rows in table view will work fine. We just are returning the count. And this is the method that we'll have to change here. This is the method that gives us back the specific views depending on, well, what it's looking for, right? Depending on the row. So this is where we do some hack and slash. So let's go ahead and comment this section out just so I can reference it, because it's sometimes nice to reference old code. So what are we doing in this part? Well, we want to figure out basically what view we should return given the object that we're looking at. So to figure out what object we're looking at, we want to know what row we're on, and we can get the desktop entity at the specific table contents row. Now once we know that, we can figure out, well, hey, if it's a folder, let's do something. If it's an image, then let's do something else. How can we figure that out? Well, we can ask the entity what class it is, and you can do that by using the isKindOfClass method. And this method will simply ask you for the class of whatever it's comparing it to, right? So it's saying, are you a specific class? And then we want to ask it if it's a folder entity class. So if the entity is the desktop folder entity class, then it's a folder. So that's what we want. Now we want to get the view for the folder, right? And the folders are represented by that NSTextField group cell. So we'll just call it group cell. And we want to ask the TableView to make a view with identifier. And the identifier we want is the group cell. Owner will be self. Then we want the group cell. Since it's an NSTextField, we just want to set the string value. And the string value we want is just the entity's name, like so. Alright, and then when we're done that, we just return it. And that's good. Now we're done with that group cell. The other thing that can happen is we have an entity, which is the kind of class of NS, what am I thinking of? No, not NS, desktop image entity class. If it's a desktop image entity class, then it's a desktop image entity, and that means it has images. So to do this one, we want to take the NSTableView, and we'll call it cell view, get table view. The table view we want to call make view with identifier, image cell, self, and then we want to set a bunch of stuff on it. So cell view dot text field set string value, and we want to set the string value to whatever the entity's name is, like we did before. Then we want to take the cell view dot image view, set the image to be whatever the entity's image is, so entity image. And we have to typecast this though, because as we see it, the desktop entity is just a desktop entity and it doesn't contain an image, right? Only the desktop image entities do. But we already figured out here that it is a desktop image entity, so we can typecast this, and now we can set that. Now we're done with all that good stuff, and we can return the cell view. Alright, and if all else fails, we return nil as usual. Okay, so there we go. That's that. And we should be good to go. So we haven't actually talked about groups yet. That will come, but as you can see, we have identified which ones are groups and which ones are image cells. So we have our Feng Shui group there, but it doesn't actually act as a group cell. It just kind of shows up as a group here in a very large size, and that's that. So nothing too special about it yet. Let's make it a group. So how do we do that? Well, we can add a few methods. So the two TableView methods that we need, TableView, let's start with isGroupRow. So isGroupRow is pretty obvious. It determines whether a particular row should be a group row. So it's just your job to figure that out. So desktop entity gets table contents row. Alright, and if this particular entity is kind of class, like we've done 100 times already, and that phone's going to ring, so I'm going to wait. All right, and the phone stopped ringing, so we'll continue. Desktop folder entity, we want to check to see if that's the class we have. All right, and when the entity is done, or when we've identified that it's a folder entity, right, we can now specify that yes, this is a group row, right? That's, if it's a folder entity, it is a group row, so we return yes. Otherwise, we return no. So let's check it out. Let's see what we got out of that. So by implementing that one method, you get this, rather large. We haven't really figured out the size yet, but it is a group row. It hovers over the other ones, and it has that nice sort of effect, and then it gets pushed out of the way by the next one. So there you go. You got group rows working pretty well here. The last part, though, is to fix that size issue. So to do that, we use a pretty simple method, which is TableView height of row. And this is going to work pretty much the same way. So I'm just going to copy this over to spare you guys the time. And we're simply returning the height of this given row. So if it's a folder, we want to return the height of 22. Remember, in the beginning of the tutorial, I was saying how the height of the group rows is 22 points or pixels. If not, you can just look at that in the interface builder and see how high your NS text field is. Nonetheless, if it's not, then we just wanted to return the normal thing. So TableView, what am I looking for? Row height. All right, and that just gives us back the default row height, which is what everything else is. So as you can see now, the group rows are properly sized to their smaller size, and they still hover over the nice little pieces. Then when we push it away, boom, it goes away like that. There you go, nice stuff. All right, let's implement a few more things while we have time. You can quit the tutorial right now if you want, but we'll implement the rest of the stuff here. Insert new row, except will not work though, really, because now we're dealing with URLs that actually reference things on the file system, so we can't really just throw garbage in there much anymore. So I'm just going to leave that one. I haven't really thought through it. Remove selected rows should still work. I don't see why it wouldn't. We'll test that. Locate in Finder, however, will be a little different because we're not dealing with the NS dictionary anymore. So we can make this a desktop entity, and with the entities, we all have file URLs on them, right? So there is no different method for this. So if I try to look at this, we can see that there is only the select file method, and this means it takes a path. So to take a path, you have to convert the URL into a path, which is very easy. So you just say to the entity, I want the file URL, right? That gets us the NS URL that references the file that we're looking at. And then to get the path, you just return or use the method path that's on NS URL. All right, and the last part is just nil. Beautiful. Now we can go ahead and run this. Make sure everything works. Let's test out by deleting this thing. So the delete still works fine. Let's inspect to see if we can get this object here. And as you can see, it scans right to that one there that we clicked on. All right, so everything works, and we got groups. So congrats. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave your questions in the comments section below. Please subscribe to the channel, and please subscribe to me on Twitter for all random updates that I throw there. And if you have any other questions, like I said, throw them in the comments section. I'll be happy to answer. And I will see you guys in an upcoming tutorial. See you then.